The boy cost 9 cents. 9. Not dollars, not gold, not even silver, just 9 measly cents. On a bright April morning in Charleston, 1847, the auctioneer called him out like a broken tool, a discarded object no one wanted. His name was Samuel. Or at least that's what the ledger said. He was mute. He was unresponsive. He was invisible in the eyes of everyone who had ever crossed his path. Returned 3 times, rejected by 3 plantations, dismissed as defective, worthless. And yet, there was something in the way he stood still, silent, watching something that stirred in the chest of a woman who would not see him as others did. Cordelia Ravenel, a widow, once a renowned opera singer, whose voice had been stolen by disease. She walked into that auction house wearing shadows as a veil, anonymity as armor. She did not belong there. Charleston's elite thronged the room, hungry for labor and spectacle, blinded by their own sense of entitlement. And then she saw him, Samuel, the boy who would not speak, the boy who everyone had written off. There was a strange symmetry in his silence, something that mirrored her own loss, her own exile from music and recognition. No one bid. The crowd laughed at his small frame, at the way he seemed suspended between the world and a private realm of his own. Gadsden, the auctioneer, sneered, offering him for $1, for 50 cents, for 9 cents. And just like that, the transaction was made. She paid 9 cents, a price fit for a broken thing. The crowd smirked, oblivious. She led him out into the sunlight, past the stench of the waterfront, past the calls of merchants and the cries of laborers. He followed without hesitation, a shadow in motion, precise, economical, quiet. In the small house on Trad Street, she showed him to a narrow room, a bed, a basin, a trunk. He stood by the window, staring into a tiny garden, silent, patient, obedient but never human, not in the way the world expected. For weeks he existed like a ghost, pulling weeds, carrying water, cleaning, always watching, never reacting, never revealing. And yet, the eyes, they were too sharp, too knowing. There was a secret in them, a power suppressed, waiting. History rarely remembers the broken. But Samuel's silence was a mask. And behind it, something unimaginable stirred, a talent, a voice, a force that would shatter the fragile order of Charleston society. By May, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew the quiet had ended, and something dark, irresistible, and violent was about to unfold. Weeks passed, and the silence in the house became oppressive, a living thing. Cordelia watched him in the garden, in the kitchen, in the dim light of the narrow hallways. Nothing escaped his gaze. Every gesture, every whisper, every tension in the walls of her home, he catalogued it all, invisible yet omnipresent. She began to suspect that Samuel's muteness was not ignorance or defect, but concealment. There was intelligence there, more than anyone could imagine, lurking behind that placid mask. Then came the first note. It was accidental, or so it seemed, a soft, almost imperceptible hum as he worked. Cordelia froze mid-step, her heart hammering. She had heard music in years past, once hers, once brilliant, now lost. But this was something different. It wasn't simple melody. It was technique, precision, passion controlled like a weapon. Italian scales, operatic phrasing, the kind of voice that could bend rooms, hearts, and wills. She realized then what no one else had. Samuel wasn't broken. He was dangerous. Dangerous because beauty can be lethal. Dangerous because power, hidden, grows in silence. Cordelia's fascination became obsession. She began to test him, whispering commands, asking him to hum, to sing, to mimic the fragments of memory she could still summon from her old repertoire. He complied not because he wanted approval, but because he recognized opportunity. In his mind, the world was a stage, and Samuel had rehearsed for centuries in shadows. At night, the house changed. Samuel's voice emerged from the shadows of the small room, from behind the locked kitchen doors, from the faint crack in the floorboards. Notes sharp as razors, phrases that lingered like smoke, and a haunting beauty that unsettled every servant, every visitor who dared enter. Betsy the cook whispered about hearing music that wasn't music, something alive, something that watched. Patience, the house girl, refused to enter the kitchen after sunset. And Cordelia? She sat in the parlor, trembling, enthralled, aware that this boy held a secret so powerful it could destroy the life she had painstakingly reconstructed after loss. It was not just talent. It was a weapon. And as she listened, she realized he was learning her routines, her weaknesses, the subtle rhythms of her household. Every note carried observation, every pause calculated. The boy who cost 9 cents was becoming indispensable and terrifying. And now, listen closely, because this is where you must engage. Pause for a moment. Type in the comments, not once, but twice. I see the hidden truth. Let the words anchor you. Let them mark you as someone who is willing to descend into the knowledge most fear. Only after that can you truly understand what Samuel was capable of and what that voice demanded from the world. Because talent, when intertwined with darkness, rarely remains contained. It feeds, it waits, and it does not forgive. By early June, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with Samuel's presence, as if the silence he carried had become a force pressing against every corner. Cordelia noticed it first in the servants. Betsy moved like a shadow, always listening, never speaking, her hands trembling when Samuel passed. Patience avoided the garden entirely, claiming sudden illnesses that vanished when Samuel was absent. Even the household cat refused to enter the rooms where he lingered. Fear, subtle and pervasive, had begun to take root. Samuel, however, remained outwardly composed. Every gesture measured, every step deliberate. He didn't speak, but the house responded to him as if it understood language he never needed. Doors opened slightly before he reached them. Windows caught the breeze at his approach. Meals were prepared with exact precision. Cordelia recognized the pattern. It was influence, not magic, though it felt indistinguishable from it. A presence so quiet, so unassuming, yet capable of bending behavior without a word. Then came the night of the first true performance. Cordelia had retired early, lingering in her parlor with her fading journal and a candle. Samuel appeared without announcement, as if summoned by the faint light. He stood in the doorway and lifted his head, exhaling a single note that fractured the air. It was pure, precise, operatic. The sound was physical, pressing against the ribs, vibrating the bones, stirring memories long buried. Cordelia felt herself shiver, a recognition of her own lost power in the voice of this boy she had bought for a trivial sum. The note ended, but the silence that followed was louder than anything she had ever heard. Samuel had claimed the room without speaking. And in that silence, the first hint of menace emerged, a sense that this boy could do more than enchant. He could command. Every gesture after that first note seemed intentional, a deliberate shaping of her perception. She understood, instinctively, that his voice was not a gift, it was leverage. Could seduce, manipulate, even destroy. By the next morning, Cordelia found subtle signs that the household was already shifting to his will. Tasks she had assigned without thought were completed with exacting precision. Instructions were anticipated, not followed. Betsy and Patience exchanged glances in silence, eyes wide with unease. Samuel had become more than a servant. He was the axis around which the house now turned. And yet, she could not stop watching. There was a dangerous allure in his control, a fascination that bordered on obsession. She knew, deep down, that someone so intelligent, so perceptive, could easily become lethal. But the knowledge came with a caveat. It would change her too, shape her into someone who could no longer look at the world in innocence. She was no longer a mistress in her own home. She was an audience to something ancient, uncanny, and dangerous, unfolding in the quietude of a boy they had all underestimated. The walls held their breath. The air itself seemed to wait, and Samuel, mute yet omnipotent, smiled for the first time, not at her, not at the servants, but at the chaos he could already sense rising in the invisible currents around him. By mid-June, the house on Trad Street had become a theater of shadows. Samuel's silence was no longer passive, it was a language, a tool of observation, of control, of quiet terror. Every servant, every visitor, every unsuspecting guest sensed the undercurrent in the air before they saw him. He moved like a ghost, precise, deliberate, a specter whose power grew with every passing day. No one spoke unless he allowed it. No one acted unless he permitted it. Cordelia began to notice a pattern that chilled her more than it fascinated her. Samuel did not merely respond to the world, he shaped it. He began testing limits, small at first. Betsy, the elderly cook, found her routines subtly altered. Ingredients moved without her touch, fires extinguished before she could tend them, minor mishaps that felt uncanny. Patience, once confident and cheerful, started sleeping in fits, whispering fragmented nightmares to herself about the boy who hears everything. Even Cordelia felt a tremor in her chest when he passed, as though her own thoughts were exposed, her own fears catalogued. He was teaching the household what true observation and patience could achieve, and the lessons were not gentle. And then came the first night of deliberate terror. Cordelia had retired, a candle flickering in the parlor. Samuel entered silently, his bare feet making no sound, and positioned himself where the light barely touched him. He lifted his head and sang a single, perfect note that ripped through the quiet like a blade. The sound carried both ecstasy and menace. It was operatic brilliance, yes, but something darker lay beneath. Every tone was calibrated to stir fear, fascination, awe. The candle trembled. The shadows deepened. Cordelia felt her pulse slow as if the room itself obeyed him. By dawn, the servants' loyalty had shifted. They whispered, hesitant, fearful, their wills bending under the silent gravity of Samuel's presence. Betsy would not leave his side when he lingered near the kitchen. Patience refused to enter any room he had been in without Cordelia present. And Cordelia herself, once the mistress, once the orchestrator, realized she had become a spectator in her own home, drawn to the brilliance and horror of what she had purchased for 9 cents. Samuel's operatic voice was no longer just a marvel. It was a weapon, a psychological lever, an instrument of control. In its power lay the first whispers of death, the notion that those who resisted or underestimated him would not merely fail, they would suffer. The first mortal consequence was still to come, subtle but inevitable, and yet Cordelia could not turn away. She was complicit in the escalation, entranced by the darkness that coiled behind that mute exterior. In the quiet, the house waited. Samuel waited, and the first life that would break beneath the weight of his talent and intent had already been chosen, though no one yet realized it. Because in a house dominated by silence and brilliance, the faintest note could decide who lived and who died. By the end of June, the house on Trad Street had become a crucible of power and obsession. Samuel's presence no longer merely influenced, it commanded. Every breath, every gesture, every note he produced shaped the household like a conductor controlling an orchestra with invisible hands. Cordelia watched in a mixture of fear and awe as her servants bent to his will. Betsy moved with a precision she had never known. Patience's eyes darted constantly, as if anticipating his thoughts. And Cordelia herself found her attention fractured, her every instinct subverted by fascination. The boy they had dismissed for 9 cents was now orchestrating their lives with uncanny precision. Then came the evening when the first real danger emerged. A guest, a young merchant from the Lowcountry, had been invited to one of Cordelia's salons, unaware of the quiet storm inside her home. He laughed too loudly, criticized the arrangement of flowers in the parlor, dismissed the subtle tension that lingered in the air. Samuel entered silently, a shadow among shadows. The boy opened his mouth and sang, not a song of beauty, but a song of warning. Operatic phrases, flawless in their execution, reverberated with such force and clarity that the merchant froze mid-step. His laughter faltered, his body tensed. Every muscle responded involuntarily to the power in Samuel's voice. Cordelia realized, with a cold thrill, that the boy could do more than enchant. He could manipulate, dominate, even terrify without raising a hand. And the guest, blissfully unaware of what had seized him, grew increasingly agitated. The notes sliced through reason, stirred fear that he could not name, and finally he attempted to leave. Samuel's eyes followed him. One final note, sustained, precise, a haunting crescendo, and the merchant stumbled, collapsing to the floor, trembling. Silence swallowed the room. Cordelia's breath caught. She had witnessed genius and terror coiled together in human form. The incident marked a turning point. Samuel's power had a cost. Every display left ripples of unease. Every demonstration of skill tightened the invisible web he wove around the household. Cordelia understood that fascination had become danger, admiration had become fear. The boy's silence was a weapon. His voice, a form of execution. And in that room, beneath the dim light, she glimpsed the first shadow of murder, not just the collapse of a man's body, but the unraveling of social order, the exposure of secrets Charleston had carefully buried. By July, whispers had begun. A neighbor mentioned a strange voice singing through the walls at night. Patrons at her salon sensed something unsettling, a brilliance that frightened as much as it captivated. Samuel's control was no longer private. It had begun to leak into the city, into the consciousness of a society that believed itself untouchable. And somewhere in the distance, beneath magnolia trees and cobblestone streets, the first corpse awaited its unveiling, a secret that would destroy lives, reputations, and forever stain the history of Charleston. The house had become a stage. Samuel was both performer and predator. And Cordelia, once a mistress of melody herself, had become the audience to a brilliance so dark, so absolute, that the price of witnessing it might very well be her own soul. By July, the air in the house on Trad Street had thickened with tension, like fog before a storm. Samuel's influence was no longer subtle. It had become unavoidable. Every movement in the house responded to his presence as though it were guided by invisible strings. Cordelia began to notice it in herself. A tightening in her chest, a compulsive need to observe, to measure, to anticipate. She realized, with a shiver, that she was no longer mistress, she was witness, participant, perhaps even prey in a quiet war of wills. Samuel's music had grown darker. No longer merely beautiful, it carried intent. Each operatic phrase was precise, carefully calibrated to elicit reaction, to bend perception. A servant would enter a room and find their fears amplified. A stray comment would become a source of shame or panic. Cordelia began to keep her distance, compelled by fascination yet repelled by the cold precision in his eyes. She recognized that his talent was a form of control so absolute it left no room for resistance. Then came the night that changed everything. Samuel's voice, low at first, rose and measured, haunting arcs that seemed to echo off the walls of the old house. Cordelia sat in the parlor, listening as shadows lengthened, as her heart matched the rhythm of a pulse not her own. The servants Betsy, Patience stood frozen in corners, their faces pale, their bodies taut with an awareness they could not articulate. The song was a command, a warning, a prophecy, all rolled into one. A visitor, a distant cousin who had come to inspect the household accounts, laughed nervously at Samuel's performance. That laugh broke the rhythm, and the consequences were immediate. Samuel's eyes locked on him. The notes surged like steel, each one striking at nerves, at reason, at willpower. The cousin collapsed, convulsing, trembling, eyes wide with terror. Cordelia, horrified yet mesmerized, understood she had seen the first death of influence, death not of the body alone, but of the mind, the certainty of control. The next morning, the house was quieter. Too quiet. Betsy avoided eye contact. Patience whispered about the boy who sees everything. Cordelia, sitting at her window, realized the pattern. Samuel's power was cumulative. Each demonstration, each display of genius, tightened the invisible web. No one could resist him. No one could leave unchanged. And Charleston itself, with its fragile veneer of civility, its obsession with appearances, was unknowingly susceptible. By August, rumors circulated, strangers speaking of a boy with a voice that haunted the night, that could bend men to their knees, that left witnesses shaken to their core. Samuel had become more than a servant. He was a force, a dark instrument of revelation and punishment. And Cordelia, still entranced, still trapped by curiosity and awe, understood that they were all teetering on the edge of something irreversibly destructive. The stage was set, and beneath the magnolia trees, the first corpse silent, still, a testament to the lethal brilliance of a boy bought for 9 cents awaited discovery. By late August, the house on Trad Street had become a chamber of psychological terror. Samuel's presence was no longer just influential, it was absolute. Cordelia watched herself and her household bend to the rhythms of his silence and voice, the invisible authority he wielded without effort. The servants no longer moved independently. Every glance, every step, every breath aligned with the invisible patterns he had created. Betsy trembled when he passed. Patience avoided the rooms he had occupied. And Cordelia herself realized, with a mixture of fear and awe, that she had become complicit in the expansion of his power. Then the scandal began. A wealthy visitor, a prominent figure in Charleston's social circles, arrived for one of Cordelia's famed musical evenings. Samuel, as always, remained unseen at first, a shadow observing from the periphery. When the visitor dismissed the house and its arrangements with casual arrogance, Samuel chose to respond not with words, but with his operatic voice. Notes poured from the shadows, precise, immaculate, carrying subtle menace beneath their beauty. The visitor froze, his confidence unraveling under the invisible pressure. He tried to leave. One final phrase, long and vibrating, shattered his composure. He collapsed into the parlor, eyes wide, trembling, body unsteady. The room held its breath as the truth sank in. This boy, this 9-cent servant, could control not just behavior, but the will of a man. Cordelia understood then that Samuel was more than a gifted performer. He was a predator. Every note, every pause, every silence was carefully calculated. There would be no accidental revelations, only deliberate lessons in power. The boy had become a master of psychological domination. And yet, the darkest lessons were yet to come. As Charleston's whispers grew, neighbors spoke of music that unnerved, voices that commanded, and servants who acted as though under a spell. Samuel's influence seeped beyond the walls of the house. The social elite, obsessed with propriety and status, could not comprehend that they were vulnerable. And in the shadows, beneath magnolia trees, the first corpse, the inevitable consequence of genius married to menace, lay hidden, a warning that few would dare acknowledge. Cordelia, entranced and horrified, realized that the boy she had purchased for 9 cents had rewritten the rules of her existence. She could no longer separate fascination from fear, admiration from terror. Samuel had become both instrument and arbiter, shaping the world according to a rhythm no one else could perceive. And now, if you've been following, it's time to anchor yourself again. Type in the comments, twice, "I claim the hidden knowledge." Let it bind you to the truths you are witnessing. Because what comes next is the final descent, the exposure of corruption, scandal, and the ultimate reckoning for those who underestimated a boy bought for 9 cents. The house, the city, and the fragile morality of Charleston itself were about to be irreversibly tested. September arrived, heavy and suffocating, as if Charleston itself sensed the culmination of what had been set in motion. The house on Trad Street had become a shrine to a quiet tyranny. Samuel's presence was no longer subtle. It was omnipresent, an invisible force that bent the household, manipulated the minds of visitors, and exerted power over every inch of space he occupied. Cordelia, once the mistress of her domain, now felt the full weight of complicity, trapped in fascination and fear alike. She knew that whatever unfolded next would be irreversible. The final night began innocuously, as Cordelia prepared for another salon. Charleston's elite arrived, unaware that the performance they anticipated would become a lesson in control and mortality. Samuel positioned himself behind the walls, a ghost, listening to the rhythms of their movements, cataloging their weaknesses. When a visiting dignitary mocked the household staff, a ripple of anticipation ran through the room. Samuel waited, silent, invisible. Then he sang. The first note was soft, almost delicate, but within it lurked precision, menace, and undeniable authority. Each subsequent phrase built a crescendo that disoriented the mind, bending perception and unspooling certainty. Eyes widened, hands froze mid-gesture, breaths caught in throats. One man, cocky, dismissive, drunk with privilege, tried to leave. A final note struck him with unbearable force, not loud, not harsh, but calculated with the accuracy of a scalpel. He collapsed, unconscious or worse, and fell beneath the magnolia in the garden, unseen by all except Samuel. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural. The room trembled with the weight of unspoken realization. Cordelia, pale and trembling, understood that genius had become weaponized, that beauty could kill as easily as it could enthrall. Samuel's mute exterior had been a lie, his silence a prelude to mastery. The boy who had cost 9 cents had rewritten the rules of power in the house, and by extension, the fragile morality of Charleston. The aftermath was a mixture of terror and awe. No one could explain what had happened, yet all felt its reverberation. Samuel continued his work, his eyes quietly calculating, observing, perfecting control. Cordelia kept her distance, haunted by the knowledge that she had borne witness to something forbidden and irrevocable. The city whispered, the servants shivered, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, and the boy, mute, powerful and terrifying, remained, a living testament to the danger of underestimation. He had proven that one who is dismissed, one who is overlooked, can harbor a force so potent it bends reality itself. Charleston would never speak of what occurred, but history, in fragments, would remember the shadow of a 9-cent purchase, a voice capable of unmaking men, and a darkness that could not be ignored. Because some truths once heard change everything. And once you have listened, there is no returning to ignorance. Samuel had sung. Samuel had conquered. And those who survived carried the knowledge and the fear forever. Did you hear the boy's voice? Comment, I see the hidden truth. Twice if you dare to acknowledge what most refuse to see. Share this with someone who seeks secrets buried by history, and subscribe to uncover more forbidden knowledge that the world tried to erase.